Desperate journeys, drastic solutions. What to do with the millions of migrants fleeing conflict, persecution and poverty? Can the countries they're heading to pay to make the problem go away? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Exact figures are hard to come by, but as the global population grows and the world is blighted by conflict, persecution and poverty, more people are on the move than ever before. And while rights groups point to moral and international obligations to take in the many migrants seeking a better life, the sheer number involved is making that increasingly difficult. Australia has taken a hard line, detaining refugees and asylum seekers arriving by boat in offshore detention centres and turning or towing boats away. It has now gone a step further by offering Cambodia millions of dollars to take them off its hands. Only 4 of the nearly 700 detainees on Nauru Island have so far taken up the offer of resettlement. Now, Jazeera's Rob McBride was in the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, when those first volunteers arrived.
They arrived with little ceremony, hidden inside a van. The governments of Cambodia and Australia were equally sensitive, with no official comment. But Australians involved in aid work here were more vocal.
The ethics of compassion, the ethics of hospitality, even the ethics of justice from a very rich country with lots of space leave a lot to be desired.
Under the agreement, refugees refused entry into Australia and currently languishing on the remote Pacific island of Nauru are given the option of being moved to Cambodia. They are promised start-up money, a home, a job and access to schools and hospitals. The only problem is, it's Cambodia. One of Asia's most impoverished nations and with a poor record on human rights and dealing with asylum seekers from neighbouring countries.
Instead of assisting the way that Cambodians can handle the problem, Australia turned their blind eyes to the human rights situation to ensure that they can clear their own problem and put more burden on Cambodia.
The burden on Cambodia is eased by the cash the refugees represent. The agreement is worth around $40 million over the next few years, money that the Australians are putting up. But since being signed last September, these are only the first 4 volunteers, making them look like very expensive imports. The International Refugee Organization, IOM, has helped in the transfer after receiving guarantees about what the newcomers will receive here. But if the deal is so good, why so few takers?
They've weighed this up in their own minds. They decided that they want to come here. We don't know how many more will be convinced and want to come here, but the important thing to emphasize is no one's being coerced to come here. They're coming here voluntarily. It's not what they wanted. They wanted to be in Australia, but they are better off than they were at home, and they're better off than they were in Nauru.
How much better off they will have lots of time to ponder on the long, balmy evenings ahead of them in a place they never thought would be home. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Phnom Penh.
We bring in our guest now, joining us from Geneva, Leonard Doyle, a spokesman for the International Organisation for Migration. And in Siem Reap in Cambodia, we have Denise Coghlan, Director of the Jesuit Refugee Service. And Denise, I know we heard from you in Rob McBride's story just then about the 4 refugees going to Cambodia. We'll come back to you on that in just a moment. But Leonard Doyle, first of all, 4 refugees out of 700. Is this simply a balm on Australia's conscience, or could something like this work?
Well, I mean, we're talking about one country here in a tide of displacement and migration around the world that reaches 50 million. So I'm not sure that this is going to be the cure for displacement, far from it, if that's what you're asking.
Is it a sort of hideous example of how the more wealthy countries can try to buy off the poorer countries, and left in the middle are those people who are the most desperate, the refugees?
Well, I'm not going to characterize any country's motivations. I mean, what International Organization for Migration does is stand by the migrants and look out for their interests.
Well, does this help them?
We're certainly not going to allow people be brought to another country and then left alone. So we're happy to play a role, as we do in many countries in the world, in ensuring that migrants are looked after, whether that's in Lampedusa, whether that's in Cambodia, no matter where it is.
Does it help them there? What do you think of that? Are they benefiting at all from this?
Well, if you're talking about the individual refugees in this case, clearly they're benefiting if they've chosen to go and they're happy to do so, and the indications we have is that they're happy, then that would seem to be correct, unless you've got something to the contrary to tell me.
Well, let's ask Denise, who's seen the sharp end of this from the Cambodian point of view and saw those, or will be following the case of those 4 refugees. Do you think anything like this is going to be a long-term solution, either for them or for the bigger population of refugees as a whole in that area?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say welcome to the 4 who've come to Cambodia, and I do hope it will be better for them. But I wonder whether they're really going to stay here or they're taking the chance to get to another country. Obviously, they've benefited in this first instance because they were given a huge sum of money, in their terms, to move from Nauru to Cambodia. They're being given very beautiful accommodation, and there are lots of services available for them. But whether this is going to be a long-term solution for them after the first 12 months, that's open to question. My experience with more than 2,000 refugees in Cambodia over the last 25 years has led me to believe that very, very, very few people decide to stay in Cambodia.
Let me go back to you, Leonard. In terms of helping them to settle wherever it happens to be, do you feel that you are capable of helping these people with their new lives, or is that pretty much impossible?
Well, I think as Denise has described, they're being pretty well looked after. And, the burden really is not these 4. What we really have to think about is the bigger mass of people who are trying to move to other countries, trying to improve their lives or to escape persecution. It's not going to be sustainable to give the same degree of help to, for example, the recent boat people who were left on the high seas by the smugglers in the Andaman Sea. It could never happen. No government could possibly sustain it. So clearly this is a sui generis case. And we'll have to see. We can analyse this one up and down, but it's probably not that instructive in terms of the global picture of migration and the enormous problems being faced by people who are really in desperate straits as they try and seek a better life or try and escape persecution.
Leonard, let me put this to you. I was going to bring it up with our previous guest, with Denise, but we're having communication problems. Human Rights Watch, you work closely with them, and they say these 4 refugees are essentially human guinea pigs in an Australian experiment. And they go on to say Cambodia clearly has no will or capacity to integrate refugees permanently into Cambodian society. Now, you don't want to talk about Cambodia specifically, but is this a problem that you find generally with societies into which you're trying to bring the refugees, or is it very much a case of country by country?
Well, I think, societies are in transition, and it's easy for Human Rights Watch, which I admire greatly, and indeed know many of the people who work with them and think their work is fantastic. But at the end of the day, their job is to make noise and to make and to raise alarms. But maybe they've gone a little bit far in characterising this particular setup. At the end of the day, societies are changing. Globalization is changing the nature of countries. Who would have thought, 6 months ago, in a way, that the migrants who are rushing headlong towards Europe, that you'd have a similar crisis in the Andaman Sea? Those who are deeply involved in it have known that it's been going on for years, but the public certainly didn't expect, because it might have assumed that, hey, migration is all about poor people going from the underdeveloped south to the north. That's it. Well, it's not. Look what's happening. They're trying to get to Malaysia, for goodness sake. So, I think it's a far more complex problem than many people assume, and there's far too much simplistic kind of reasoning about it. And people often argue about migration from their own narrow political ideological standpoint. Not every would-be refugee, is necessarily one, and every country has its own complexities, and it's certainly worth slowing down the rhetoric a little bit and just unpacking the problem and finding out how best can we go forward in the interests of the migrants or in the interests of the refugees.
Leonard, thanks. I'll be back with you in just a second. Still having some communication problems with our other guest. We can get a visual impression of how the number of migrants has gone up in the world as a whole over the past 50 or so years. Take a look at this. It's from the Migration Policy Institute. 1960 and the migrant population stood at around 77 million. The latest figures show it rising to more than 231 million. Well, Europe's the chosen destination for thousands of refugees escaping the conflicts in North Africa and the Middle East, many of them setting off by boat, perhaps to Italy, perhaps to Greece. But there have been mixed feelings about the scale of rescue missions. Take a listen to this. Speaking in October, the UK Foreign Office Minister Joyce Annally, quote, "We understand that by withdrawing this rescue cover, and it has changed," she doesn't say that, I'm just pointing it out, "we will be leaving innocent children, women and men to drown who otherwise would have been saved." But eventually word will get around the war-torn communities of Syria and Libya and the other unstable nations of the region that we are indeed leaving innocent children, women and men to drown. And when it does, they will think twice about making the journey. And so eventually, over time, more lives will be saved. Cynical or not, it was a point of view, what's described as the pull effect. If you keep people coming and allow them to continue to do so, then more people will perhaps follow their lead. We're going to go now to our correspondent, Hoda Abdul Hamid. She witnessed firsthand the desperation and, well, the terrible emotions of some of those making that terrible, perilous journey across the Mediterranean.
Their stories are common ones of escape from war, oppression and poverty. Their ordeals a symbol of the many troubles of our times. Risking their lives across the Mediterranean Sea was their only option. They were found adrift in the water by the Guardia di Finanza, the Italian border police. The rush to get on board the Italian ship, a testimony of how frightened they were, stranded in the water with no coast in sight. He says the Libyan skipper abandoned them. They had no water or food. No one knew how to steer the boat. People were panicking. Their suffering is etched on their faces. Some stare into oblivion, perhaps trying to come to terms with what they've been through. Naama left behind her 2 children with her mother in Somalia. Her husband is in Yemen. She lost contact with him when war broke out there 2 months ago.
We could not talk or ask anything in Libya. Each time we opened our mouth, they would beat us with a stick. They raped us until we paid money. It was horrible. I never expected to be treated like that in an Arab country. There was no mercy. I really thank Italy. Nobody has been so nice with us in a long time.
The women huddle together, even though the ship is slowly taking them away from the African coast. Forgetting the rape and humiliation won't be possible. Some are pregnant. There are also many teenagers. Faisal had first fled from Somalia to Yemen, but war caught up with him, so he had to move again.
In Sudan, I was captured and locked in a house for 18 days. I escaped and went to Libya. I was penniless. I left Yemen with nothing on me. I was hoping to find some compassion, but nothing. Today is my birthday. When I touch land, I will drink 10 Pepsis to celebrate. It's a new beginning.
The deck was silent. Many slumped into deep sleep. The ship continued to sail back to Europe. As night falls and the coast of Italy appears, life returns on deck. Now there are smiles, perhaps the first ones in a long time.
This is the moment they've been waiting for so patiently here on deck. The moment they can get off the boat and touch land. For them it means they're finally in Europe. A whole new life is starting, even though they don't know what it means.
There's a rush to get off the ship. This time there's excitement, maybe even amazement, that after suffering so much, there are some of the lucky ones who made it to Europe. Hoda Abdul Hamid, Al Jazeera, Lampedusa.
Well, this is striking a chord with the public, it appears, as well as politicians. Let's bring in Anders Lustgarten, who's written a play called Lampedusa, that island in the Mediterranean where so many of these unfortunates go to. We'll talk about the play itself in just a moment, when it's going to open. But give us the basis for why you felt the need to write this, Anders.
Because I think there's something extraordinarily malicious about European immigration policy, which up until now, and particularly in 2014, was about deliberately making sure that people would drown. It was about taking away the protective schemes, the Mare Nostrum schemes and the other rescue operations in the Mediterranean, on the assumption that would deter people from coming. And that doesn't work. It's also morally and ethically totally unacceptable. And I wanted initially to raise awareness that this process was going on, and now, in a way, to give a voice to the voiceless, to give a voice to these people who are always seen as a mass of undifferentiated faces.
And as we should point out, because of the noises in the background, you're at Heathrow Airport. Thanks for sparing the time.
Yes, I apologise for the environment. It's not ideal.
But let me ask you this. We've been talking in this programme about the fact that Australia is throwing money at Cambodia to get the refugees off its shores. Is there a sense that this is also what's happening in Europe with the policy of, look, we may not want to rescue these people because then they won't want to come. We will keep them away.
Definitely, and I think you can see that one of the serious proposals from the EU in its response. So initially they cut the Mare Nostrum rescue programme down to a much more reduced programme called Triton, which led to inevitably large numbers of deaths. They are now seriously talking about bombing the boats that are used, which is, apart from that, it simply won't work because most of those boats are fishing boats and you can't tell the difference between a fishing boat and a migrant boat. Ethically, that's just insane. And what's really important here, I think, is that we have to understand the West's responsibility for the causes of migration. So the World Bank displaced 3.4 million people in the last decade. We look at a place like Libya, which is a client state for people smugglers. That's a place that the West bombed and left with no reconstruction of infrastructure. So the things that we're doing to cause migration are the things we never talk about. And rather than treating these people as some kind of tidal wave that's trying to oppress civilization, we should look at our responsibilities and the things we can do to stop people coming across. If we didn't leave these people, if we didn't back regimes like the Sisi regime in Egypt, which is cracking down on dissidents and Arab Spring revolutionaries, we wouldn't have these waves of people. So let's get to grips with how the West can stop causing migration before it starts demonizing and persecuting migrants.
Have these poor people become the gypsies and the Jews of the 1930s?
I think that's a very interesting analogy. Yeah, I mean, I think in a way they're responding to the systematic deprivation of the global South, really. Not everything that's happened there is the fault of the West, but if you look at the effect of development banks, particularly in impoverishing and destabilizing countries for decades, inevitably people who are displaced or who can't make a living or who are starving, they will have to go somewhere and they will see the West on TV and they will look here. What I've also got in the play is an English arm. And there's something really interesting to me about what's happening in austerity in the West is very much it's a parallel to and an expansion on structural adjustment that's been done in the South. So what's being done to poor people in the South is what's being done to poor people in the West.
Is there
and we need a solidarity there, I think.
Is there a message of hope, any kind of thing for the people to grab onto to think that this could change? Is there that kind of message in Lampedusa, your play?
There is. It ends very strongly on a note of hope, which is, I think, the thing I'm most proud of in it. It ends on both the characters in it are not actually liberal people. They're not people who would naturally embrace outsiders, and they develop relationships through the course of their work. One is a Coast Guard who pulls out the dead from the Mediterranean. One is a payday loan collector, and they develop a sense of a human connection with the people they're dealing with against their will that I think is quite moving and is deeply optimistic. And I don't think we can have any form of politics in migration or in any other field without a sense of optimism that things can become better. There's something, like I was saying before, about solidarities between the people who are being oppressed by austerity and the people who are being oppressed by structural adjustment that I think is really fruitful and positive and will be where radical politics will come from in the next 10 years or so.
Anders Lustgarten, campaigner on migration and refugees and playwright. I know Lampedusa opens at the end of the month at the Soho Theatre in London, in the West End. Thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So, Denise Coghlan, re-established contact with you, I'm pleased to say. So we've heard about the real Lampedusa. We've heard about the Lampedusa that's going to be performed on the stage. It's a question about changing public perception, that these are really people rather than just numbers. How would you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, I think people really need to get to know and meet a real refugee, to meet somebody in their own country because I think people's perceptions change when they actually meet people and have something to do with them, and they see them as people like themselves. And then I think in the case of Australians, it's very hard to understand why we, who all come from either convicts, we're descendants from convicts unless we're part of the original population, or we're descendants of economic migrants, or we're descendants of people who've been stolen out of orphanages during the war, or we're people who've really, descendants of people who've come to try and have a better chance in another country. And I think when we look at the ethnic and religious persecution in our region, and we look at the people who are trying to escape abject poverty, it's hard to imagine why we can't let anybody else have a chance. So first of all, it's contact with the refugees themselves, seeing human faces of the people, and then trying to regain something of the compassion that was spoken about earlier. That is one of the key virtues in Asia, in both Islamic religion, in Christian religion, and in Buddhism, metta karuna, to see if once again we can take that back into our own hearts and offer hospitality to the people who are escaping really dire situations.
Leonard Doyle, tell me a little bit about the difference. Is there a difference between people who are fleeing their countries because of violence, sexual violence, murder, all sorts of atrocities being committed on them and their communities, and an economic migrant? Is there a difference? Should people be treated differently?
Well, of course there's a difference, but one also has to remember that both are in the same group as well. And a refugee or an asylum seeker can also be an economic migrant. I mean, many of the refugees appearing on the shores of Europe already have some degree of protection where they've been staying in camps, supposedly in Lebanon or in Jordan. But they decide that rather than rot away in the camp, where life is most uncomfortable and perhaps even dangerous, that they should move on to a better life because their lives are getting on and their family and their young children need support. So at that stage, they're probably acting as economic migrants. So I think there's a real danger in trying to decide, well, they're the refugees, they deserve this degree of protection, and indeed refugees do deserve a level of protection. But those migrants over there, those economic migrants, they're a bad lot and they've been paying smugglers, so we'll send them all back, unceremoniously back to where they came from. Because the world is a dangerous place and the economy of the world is very rough on a lot of people. There's many reasons that people leave, from corruption to persecution to economic dislocation. So I'd caution against, turning it into a polemic, as we've heard from your playwright guest. I think that kind of does a disservice to the migrants and to the refugees to turn it into, it's all because of globalization, therefore we've got to fix that first, or it's the West which is responsible. I think that doesn't serve them in any way, nor do I think, we do them any justice by saying, we've got to be tougher on them because we can't have queue jumpers. We've got to have more humane and sensible policies. I mean, I thought your report from Hamid was just extraordinary, and one needs to just for a moment think about the terror, the sheer terror that these children, these very vulnerable people, these women, indeed men, feel when they're left adrift after spending a lot of money going into enormous debt to make this journey. Whether it's the right thing or not, these are human beings totally deserving of our support and deserving of being rescued.
Denise, just a quick one. I'm afraid it'll have to be short. Why do we appear to dehumanise these people?
That's a question. Perhaps we've let compassion dry up in our hearts. But what I'd also like to say, in addition to what Leonard just said, is that I think we're looking for other forms of protection besides those offered by the Refugee Convention. I think the Refugee Convention can only look after the protection of a certain group of people, but the world still needs other instruments that look after people who are fleeing from abject poverty.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you very much indeed. That is Leonard Doyle in Geneva and Denise Coghlan in Siem Reap in Cambodia. Our thanks also going to Anders Lustgarten. Thank you, too, for watching. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts. You can contact us on our programme page, aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, David Foster, and the whole team here, goodbye for now. See you next time.